This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Hi, welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. Today in studio, we have Dr. Mike Lacki. Dr. Lacki is a professor of wildlife ecology and management in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. It's a pleasure to have you in studio today. Now, we're close to Halloween, and today's episode focuses on bats. We're looking forward to hearing about your research that you've been doing on bats. And before we get started talking with you about that, tell us a little bit about your background and what you do here at UK.
I went to undergraduate school at University of Dayton. From there, I went to Ohio State for my master's, and then eventually to North Carolina State for my PhD. Here at UK, I do research focusing on threatened and endangered forest bat species. In addition to that, I teach courses at the undergraduate and graduate level, and I help in student advising.
Okay. So what first got you interested in wildlife?
It's interesting you ask that because as a child and even a young adult, I always wanted to be a paleontologist. And I remember when I was starting to look at schools, my parents kind of looked at me and kind of was like, my dad especially, he goes, "How are you going to make a living as a paleontologist?" And of course, I think they got all the guidance counselors at the high school on board with them because they all gave me the same look and the same reaction. And so, given that I had no support to go to school in paleontology, they kind of coerced me into what they thought was the next closest thing, which was biology. And they said, go into biology and then figure out, what direction you might want to go in that makes sense. And I went and got a degree in biology and still felt kind of unsatisfied. And at that point, had been working for an ecologist who did studies on squirrels and kind of was telling him, I'd like to try something a little different. And he knew a faculty member at Ohio State who had a project to study bats on the Wayne National Forest in southeast Ohio. And so I went to meet with Dr. Bookout and talk to him, and it was a good meeting. I liked him and decided I would go ahead and take a stab at that project, and as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, that's good.
So this is our Halloween special. It's close to Halloween, and so we were wondering, how did bats get associated with Halloween?
That's an interesting question because I don't know that we really know the true answer. I believe the whole idea of Halloween is rooted in European culture. Bats are kind of, almost not so much revered, but tolerated in Europe in ways that they're not in other cultures. Bats, occupy a lot of churches and castles and buildings in Europe, and that's considered a normal condition for them. But somewhere along the way, they got connected to, I believe, the original Count Dracula, who went by Vlad Dracul. He was actually a Moldavian prince who, at the time that he came to power, had a very mean streak and basically defended his land against all comers. And one of the things that he did was to unfortunately take the individuals of the enemy and impale them on large wooden spikes, and actually have them spaced out on the landscape. So as you entered Moldavia, you would see these people dying on spikes.
Oh my.
And the whole concept was to basically say, if you come into here, this is what's going to happen to you. Okay. And it apparently was quite effective for a while, but eventually he was basically run out of his castle and forced to flee and ultimately captured, and then his day was over. But The original of Lhotka, obviously had nothing to do with sucking blood from any human being. We actually do have vampire bats, but they are not in Europe. They're actually in Central and South America. Well, there's 3 species, and they actually don't use their incisors or canines to draw blood out of their victims. They actually take their thumb on the wing and scrape and create an abrasion, typically on cattle or chickens, and then they lap the blood up with their tongue. And what's kind of weird about them is it's a very social group within that species where the blood comes back, or they come back to the roost and they actually disgorge the blood for others to share in the colony. So it's a very communal feeding each time a bat comes back. And the scientists who study them believe it's in response to the fact that their food resources are irregular and scarce, and so the only way the colony can persist over time is if blood meals are shared. And so those are the true, quote, vampires, if you will. We call them sanguinivores in the bat field. The actual connection to Dracula and Halloween, it's hard to say, but lots of myths, I guess.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting history. So what do we have? What types of species of bats do we have here in Kentucky?
We have 15 species. All of them belong to one family, the Vespertilionidae. We did have another representative of the Moloscidae at one time. The Brazilian free-tailed bat actually had large populations in Mammoth Cave before a modern man made his way into Kentucky, and at some point were run out of the cave either by Native American Indians or we're not really totally sure, but they certainly are present in the fossil record inside the cave. But as far as extant or living species in Kentucky, they're all from the same family, all fairly closely related in that regard, and they're all insectivorous. So which means they basically feed on insects, in the night sky. And, there's a little bit of variation in what they do and how they do things, but for the most part, they're all what we call mouse-eared or mouse-eared bats that in many cases, most of our bats really don't have a lot of real distinctive features to them, except for the tree bats, which are brightly colored. Yeah.
So where in the state? Are they in specific parts of Kentucky?
It depends on the species. I mean, we have them in every county of Kentucky. There are species that are more closely tied to caves, and therefore we tend to see a greater number of species in the Mammoth Cave region because of the extensive network of caves, and then another pocket of them in the eastern Kentucky on the Daniel Boone National Forest, where we have the extensive, I guess somewhere in excess of 3,000 miles of cliff line, and they occupy those cliffs as well as the caves on the Daniel Boone. But you can find bats anywhere in Kentucky. It just depends on which species you're talking about. Some are very widely distributed, and some are what we call stenotopic or really specific to a certain habitat condition. One example of that would be the endangered gray bat, which is it needs caves year-round. It not only hibernates in one set of caves, but then moves in summer to another set of caves to where it raises its young. And they never, they feed outside caves, but they are tied to wherever those caves occur in terms of their distribution.
And you mentioned they feed on insects. What, any specific types that they eat, or again, it probably depends on the species? Or?
Yeah, it does. It's quite broad. We have actually 2 species of bats called big-eared bats in the genus Cornurinus. The Virginia big-eared bat, which is federally endangered, and the Raffinus big-eared bat, which is a sister species, looks very similar. They have extremely large ears, and what they actually do, in addition to echolocation to navigate through the landscape, they use passive hearing. And they actually find their prey as the insects generate sound. And they use their enlarged ears to hear the sound generated by the insects on the surface of vegetation or rock faces. And they'll land and attack the insect there. And they kind of specialize in not the really large moths, but moths that are kind of intermediate in size, that kind of pack a nice nutrient food source. And so moths in the family Noctuidae and Notodontidae are really commonly eaten by those particular bats. And then at the other extreme, the big brown bat, which is a very common species that lives in a lot of houses here in Kentucky. It's the one that most people encounter. It has a real bad disposition. It also has a very strong, powerful set of jaws. And it actually eats large beetles like June bugs and the big horn beetles, because it actually has a powerful enough jaw to crush the chitin and access that food source, whereas a lot of other bats just simply are not, their jaws just are simply not big enough to hit that food. But across the rest of the species, they eat everything from mosquitoes to flies to other smaller moths to, pretty much the whole insect community. If it flies, it's fair game.
So they're good for getting rid of those insects that we would like not to have around the house then.
Yeah, maybe to a little degree.
Yeah.
I don't know that bat populations are ever high enough in numbers to create any kind of a control effect. But there certainly is a lot of literature out there that reminds the general public that bats do consume insects that are pests to crops, and they also consume moths who, in the larval stage, are pests to forest trees.
Okay. So how do bats communicate with each other?
They actually can use sound at both audible range that where humans can hear, but that typically happens inside the roost. And of course, they generate sound at higher frequencies that we cannot hear. That's where the term echolocation comes from. That high frequency sound is not only used to identify and locate prey in flight, but it's also used to communicate to each other. Some bats actually have territories where they'll establish a beat where they'll fly back and forth, and if another bat of the same species comes near their territory, they will let them know through vocalizations and behaviors to say, hey, this is my space, go somewhere else. So there is some communication that occurs there. We're not really far enough along with technology and research programs to get a real good picture of what happens inside roosts. But as technology improves and data sets are starting to emerge, it appears that there is communication happening both behaviorally through their body movements as well as through sound, because we do know for a fact that sometimes a bat that has found a foraging area where it successfully ate, when it comes back to the roost, oftentimes when it leaves the next time, it's being followed by others. So the communication that, hey, I found a place where we can go eat, they're communicating it. We just don't quite really know exactly how it's completely accomplished yet.
And so can you tell us a little bit about their structure inside the roost area? I don't know, the family structure or the social dynamics of them. How many live in an area? Or
Well, it depends. Okay, we have a number of bats, particularly the Myotis bats, that spend most of their summer in trees. They will form maternity colonies where the adult males are not there. It's them and their pups. What we've learned in the last 10 to 15 years is that maternity colonies are fluid. It's called fission-fusion behavior, where there is generally one or two what we call central node trees that everybody comes back to periodically to interact and communicate. But then there are other trees that are used by the colony, but not by everyone, what we call satellite trees. And the bats move in and out of the primary trees to the satellite trees and back again throughout the summer. So a colony actually makes use anywhere from 20 to 40 trees in the course of a summer. It's quite complex, and there are a number of scientists globally that have really gotten into this whole pattern recognition ways of analyzing data, looking at the movement of tagged bats as they move about trees, and have coupled it to genetic data that shows there's a tendency for bats that are like the offspring of one mother, to actually follow her and use her trees. So genetic relatedness does tend to have an effect on commonality of tree use. So, but either way, a large colony will be comprised of a number of what we call, like alpha females that have given birth to a large number of the offspring that are in that colony, and it is a fairly fluid dynamic. And we, only really discovered that within the last 10 to 15 years. Actually, the European scientists were the first to figure it out, and we've started looking at North American population, and it's a very, very common behavior.
How often do they have babies, or pups, I guess you called them?
The reproductive cycle here in North America, or at least in Kentucky, for most of our bats, is what we call delayed fertilization. They mate in the fall, typically at the entrance to caves. There is a behavior in the fall that we call fall swarming, where a cave is identified by large numbers of bats across the landscape. They come to that cave, they interact, they move about, they go ahead and mate. She stays inside her reproductive tract and remains viable throughout the winter. And then she will then ovulate at the beginning of spring. Her egg is fertilized, and she'll give birth then, usually in April, early May, and then the young start flying around the first week of June, plus or minus there. But as far as how many young, most of our bats will have only a single young per year, which from the standpoint of population recovery can be a problem for many bat species because it takes so long if something happens to the colony. But we do have some that twin. Southeastern myotis gives birth to twins. And then red bats, which are tree bats that do not occupy caves, will have anywhere from 3 to 4 young in a summer. So there are some exceptions to the single young rule, but it's one birthing period per year. Mm-hmm.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Okay, before we get back to our main segment, we're going to listen to our wildlife sounds from the forest. And for those of you that might be new listeners to our show, each week we're going to have a brief sound bite for a wildlife sounds from the forest. And Dr. Matt Springer will introduce that sound. And then later in the show, we'll hear kind of his explanation of what the animal is and a full description of what that sound is. So let's listen to Dr. Springer.
Today on Wildlife Sounds from the Forest, we're going to stick with our Halloween theme and find out what sound this is. Alright, and it's definitely coming from our Halloween theme, and we're going to find out why they make that sound.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. And what would you say is maybe what you think is the most interesting feature or behavior of a bat? Is there something unique to them?
Wow. I don't know that I can single out one particular thing. When I started getting into bats, I really enjoyed the challenge that bats presented. You have to work with an animal that's active at night. It covers large spaces on a landscape. In the winter, they're going deep into caves. And to me, what really was fun once I got into bats was just the whole physicality that was required of me to do the work. In addition to the intellectual exercises that come with trying to solve problems or questions or to identify behavior patterns. And so to single out one, I don't know that I can. They are extremely intelligent animals, and clearly their ability to navigate in space at night by using sound is so much different from, it's almost hard to imagine how their brain operates because it's not based on vision, where, that's how we, move about. And I'll often tell students when I'm in class talking about bats, particularly in caves, they will actually memorize the cave. And so when they wake up from a torpor bout or hibernation, they don't even have to echolocate to exit that cave. They already know the route. They've memorized it by the visual images by the images they get through the sound, to where they can actually fly right all the way out without ever emitting any sound because they've already know the route.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a blind person learning how to move about their house. And eventually they figure out where all the pieces of furniture are, and they know where they don't need to go. And so that part of it is the whole complexity to their system, which is so different to ours, is what makes them, I think, really fascinating for many of the scientists that study them.
Something I always wanted to know is, why do they hang upside down? Is there a reason for it?
Wow,
Or is that just a hard one?
That's a really hard question to answer. One thing I do know is the ability to hang upside down then allows them to drop when they're ready to take off and fly. They usually will drop into open airspace and then head on out. There's no, in other words, when they take off, they don't go up. It's usually always down and out. And so if you're already hanging down, you're already preconditioned to just drop, let go, and out you go. But I'm sure there is a physiological answer to that question that is not part of my my understanding and background.
So now we have a general background on bats, and thanks for providing that. So can you tell us about the research that you're focusing on?
Historically, much of my work was actually not in Kentucky. I hope people don't take that the wrong way. I've always loved the Pacific Northwest, and I got an opportunity to go out there, almost 20 years ago now, because of the forest land holding companies and the BLM and U.S. Forest Service needed someone who was willing to go into these large open landscapes and get back in there away from everyone else and tell us what we have. What are the bats doing? Where are they? And then spent the next 15 years with a number of postdocs and graduate students radio tagging bats and tracking them to the roost trees and tracking them across the landscape. And it was loads of fun, in and around the mountain lions and the grizzly bears and everything else that you have to encounter at night. But what happened to really redirect my research program was the emergence of white nose syndrome, which has caused a catastrophic loss of many, many bat species here in eastern North America. And I came back to Kentucky to tackle problems related to white nose, and hooked up with biologists at Mammoth Cave National Park. And I've been working at Mammoth Cave National Park for well over a decade now, dealing with issues related to how is white nose affecting our bats. Are there any things that we can identify that shows that bats might have an ability to persist and survive? The impact of white nose, and that's kind of where I've been at for the last 10 years. And much of the work involves, obviously, cave bats in the Mammoth Cave system. And we're even with that project, we're still radio tracking and really spending a lot of time looking at bats in spring as they come out of hibernation, because at that point they're really in the worst of all possible shape. They've already used up their fat reserves. The fungus has already caused issues for them physiologically, and so we've actually been looking at how they behave, how they respond, how they move about the landscape, and looking at survivorship of individuals who have been affected by white nose.
And what are some of the things that it does to them, the white nose syndrome?
A number of things. The first thing that we all discovered, I think, was the fact that bats, when they go into hibernation, tend to remain so for a period of about 15 to 20 days, and then they wake up and they have to get rid of their waste, their feces, their urine, because urine especially is toxic to the system, and then they reboot their immune system, and then they go back into hibernation. Well, the first thing that white nose does is the fungus forms on their wings and all the moist tissue, their nasal passages and so forth, is it's very irritating. And so it creates a cycle where they wake up more quickly. And so they end up having this pattern of, instead of every 15 to 20 days, it's maybe every 5 to 10 days. Well, when you speed that process up, each time you wake up, each time a bat wakes up, it uses so much energy. Well, when it stores fat in the fall, evolutionarily, the whole process is designed so that that fat will last till March and April. Well, with the white-nose impact, bats are running out of energy. They're burning up all their fat reserves. And so one of the biggest key factors is starvation. They simply run out of fat reserves, and there's no food available for them, or at least very little in January and February. Mm-hmm. Another thing that has been discovered is the fact that it appears that dehydration is another issue for bats, because they will end up needing to drink when they wake up from hibernation. And studies have shown that bats that are affected by white nose appear to be dehydrated compared to normal bats. And the third factor gets back to the immune system. Unfortunately, the way the cycle is set up, when they reboot the immune system every 15 to 20 days, that's the normal process. Well, when you start rebooting the immune system more frequently and more often, ultimately what happens is it starts to attack them instead of the fungus, and actually attacks their own cells, and sadly they can potentially die from their own defense mechanism against disease and infection. So all those three things intertwined together leads to a combination of factors that causes mortality.
And where is that found? I mean, what's the geographic range of it?
Well, it was first discovered in New York State in 2006. And at that point, when it was first discovered, the initial reaction was, oh, look at this. It was a curiosity. Unfortunately, when New York biologists came back 2 years later to these same caves, the entire population had collapsed. And in most infected caves, we often will see up to 95% mortality. And when you're talking 10,000 individuals or 100,000 individuals, that's a lot of bats. Mm-hmm. And it's spread like wildfire almost, and to where today it's throughout all of eastern U.S., all of the eastern Canadian provinces. It's made its way to Texas, and unfortunately we think was due to human transmission, which is, we think, how it got here from Europe, has made the jump all the way to Washington State. And now there's a lot of biologists in the Pacific Northwest that are actively monitoring and tracking whether or not it's going to spread. And, because the fear is it'll spread all the way through the Rocky Mountain region and hit populations in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and lead to catastrophic losses of the western bats. Mm-hmm. And because here in the east, no one really knows the millions that we've lost, but it's a lot. It is a lot.
So how do you actually catch the bats and to be able to track them?
There's a couple ways. One, the most common way, is what we call a mist net, which is a very fine nylon net that's sewn together with a little thread that creates little lattice to where, as the bat's flying through airspace, the whole concept is it doesn't really detect the net. Mm-hmm. And it hits the net, bounces into a basket in the net, and then, of course, we remove it then from the net that way. And the net is often placed in flyways, and usually in areas where there's a lot of other clutter around from vegetation. So you're hoping the bat is focusing on the clutter of the vegetation and not the net itself. The net is also often placed in like the turn of a bend. So as I indicated earlier, bats can memorize that flyway. Mm-hmm. You're hoping maybe they're not echolocating and they're just going to come around that turn and pow, into the net they go. Uh-huh. And it's a relatively effective technique. There's also another approach called a Harp Trap, which is actually a series of wires, almost like piano wire, suspended across, slightly apart, and you open it up at the entrance to a cave. And the bats, as they're coming out at night from the cave, will hit those wires and tumble down into, again, another catch basket underneath, where the bats are then removed and processed and handled. So those are the two most common ways.
And what kind of tracker do you put
It's a radio transmitter, typical of all other wildlife studies. The only difference with bats is it's very small, which unfortunately for us limits the length of time that we have to track them. It's usually not much more than 2 weeks. If you get a bat with an active transmitter that lasts 3 weeks, you consider yourself lucky. And so once it goes on that bat, it has a long antenna, and of course we carry a receiver that allows us to pick up the signal from the transmitter, and the signal is specific to each bat. The companies have it down to the point where you know when you pick up a signal with that frequency which individual you have. And we now have transmitters at the same time that are temperature sensitive, which allow us to know the actual body temperature of the bat. We can calibrate the speed of the signal from the transmitter. And we've learned an awful lot about what bats do during the day, particularly in summer when they're in trees. They actually lower their body temperature, not unlike hibernation. We call it torpor, to save energy. And adult females do it on a regular basis, daily basis. They'll drop their body temperature and they'll stay fairly quiet and fairly dormant. And then at the end of the day, when the sun heats the tree, their body warms up as the tree warms up. They don't have to expend energy to warm up, and once they're warm enough, out they go. But the transmitters have been hugely helpful in figuring out where they live, where they go, how far they travel. And yeah, I've spent many a day in forests across North America tracking bats with transmitters. Yeah.
So why is your research important to forests in Kentucky?
Well, I think it comes down to a number of things. The very first, and really the reason why I do it, they're part of the natural ecosystem, and they have every right to be here as we do, and everything we can do to understand what they need allows us to better manage forests in the future so that they can remain part of our natural systems. The next argument would be simply one of functionality, and that is that a natural ecosystem, once you start taking parts out of it, it's just like I tell the students, it's like a car. Yeah, you got an old car, you can take the window out, it'll still run. You can, rip up the seats, it'll still run. But sooner or later, you're going to lose something out of that car, and it's no longer going to run. Well, I kind of think we need to manage natural ecosystems in a similar fashion. You willingly allow a certain animal species to disappear. Okay, maybe it'll still operate okay, but eventually you're going to cross a threshold where you start to see problems and collapse, and because a lot of species are interconnected, both plant and animal, and when one disappears, it may affect the others. And the impact that bats can have on forest pests, particularly moths, will go a long way to helping out oaks and a lot of other tree species that can benefit by the presence of bats in particularly young oaks, seedlings, and so forth, by having bats, in the forest. So there's a functionality issue, and in my view, an aesthetic and personal reason. Yeah.
That's good. So I know that you also, in addition to your research, you also are an instructor here, a professor here in the department. And can you, for the students that might be listening, can you tell us about the undergraduate and graduate courses that you teach?
Yeah, right now I'm responsible for 2 courses. My teaching responsibilities have changed quite a bit over the years, but right now I teach Forest Wildlife Management, FOR 370. And that course is a fairly broad introduction to the management of wildlife, not just bats, but everything in temperate forests. And we look at a variety of issues related to, forest management and its impact, particularly timber harvesting, on a variety of wildlife species. I also teach a graduate course in mammalogy. It's actually new. I'm teaching it for the first time this semester, and the plan is for it to become a permanent part of the curriculum. And the goal of that course is to introduce students to all mammals and the ecology, natural history, and physiology of mammals. We also deal with conservation issues in the course, and it really is helpful to those students who ultimately want to go into wildlife, and particularly students who want to become certified by the Wildlife Society. It is one of the required courses that the Wildlife Society expects students to have, and that ultimately, I believe, was the driving force for the course to be established. And so the plan is for both of those to be taught every fall now, at least as long as I'm still on staff.
That's good. So you've presented us with a lot of great information today, and what would be a couple of take-home points that you'd like our listeners to leave with?
I think the primary one might be to don't listen to the rhetoric on bats. They're fascinating creatures. They're really not very. They're not going to hurt you. They're not harmful. They can contract rabies, and so certainly if you were to see one that's ill or on the ground, it's best to contact a state official to come pick it up. But they're fascinating creatures, and I still remember as a young boy sitting on the dock at night by myself watching the bats over the lake flying in and about and around, and to me those are experiences that have stayed with me throughout my life. And anything that the public can do to support the huge conservation effort that's now in place across the North American continent with both U.S. and Canada to protect these animals, please do. Please support it. And if you're asked not to go in a cave, please don't go into a cave, because the ability for us to spread white nose is very real. And I like having them around, and I hope that in the future we still have them around.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Lacki, for joining us today. And if you'd like more information on what you've heard in this segment today, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned for Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. Welcome to Wildlife Sounds from the Forest. Today we have Matt Springer back with us to do the sound we have today. And let's listen to that sound again. And let Matt tell us what's making that sound and why it's making that sound.
Sure. So glad to be here, and got the Halloween theme. We're talking about bats, so that's a bat. And that sound is actually the bat trying to echolocate some food to eat while it's flying around, usually moss, beetles, things like that. So it's hoping to hear a bounce back on that sound to find some food.
Okay, so is that sound that we just heard unique? That echolocation, is it unique to different bats, or do they each have different ones?
So it's unique enough that we can actually put out microphones, record that sound, and use a computer software, and find out what species of bat was actually flying around that microphone. It's unique to species, or at least a very closely related species, so much so that we can actually figure out what bats are in an area if we have those out and run the sounds through the program. So to the individual, it probably is as well. We're finding out more and more about their ability to communicate and knowing each other, so it's a good chance that with their vocalization range, it is unique to the individual, but pattern-wise, definitely to the species.
Okay, great. Okay, so why should we care about bats?
So I mentioned them eating those beetles, those moths.
Right.
Bats are basically our nighttime insect control device. Birds, in many ways, are our daytime ones, and there's so many different types of insects, and some that are only out at night, and there's concerns because some of those insects actually eat things like corn, and bats have been shown to help control those insects and help with the production of those kind of foods.
Oh, okay.
So how do bats communicate with each other?
So yeah, we heard the echolocation, which is how they find food, right? But they do a lot of communication with each other as well, just like we talk. They have their own personalities, and in many cases, their own social systems on a localized level. And there's been some research that's shown that they can actually recognize individuals, and they talk to individuals in different ways, just like we do. And a lot of times they're yelling at each other, and like, that's my spot in the tree, get out. But they do talk to each other, and it ranges from somewhere in the 9 to 200,000 hertz range. So it's a wide array of sounds that they can make, and we can only hear a small segment of that.
So why can't we hear bats?
Well, so we mentioned 9 to 200,000 hertz. We can only, with human ears, really hear 20 to 20,000 hertz.
Okay.
So we may hear some of it. We may hear mom talking to a baby as she's hanging in the tree, but we definitely can't hear those echolocation ones, and a lot of the other sounds we can't pick up as well. So it's that range that they're able to communicate in and produce those sounds. We just can't. We're at 10% of it, whereas they are able to hear almost all of it.
So if they eat at night, then how do they see?
So bats are really using that sound we heard, that echolocation, to find food. So as they're flying around, they'll make that sound, and what they're doing is they're hoping that it hits a bug, right, an insect, a moth, we'll say a moth, and it bounces back. And they use that bounce back, and they do it so frequently they can actually hone in on where that moth is, even as it's flying around, right? So this is all going full speed. These guys are flying through the air trying to catch these moths, and they'll actually be able to catch it either in their mouth, or in a lot of cases they use their wing as they fly by to catch it and scoop it into their mouth. It's quite impressive. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of why they make that sound, and a lot of people think bats are blind because they do everything at night. Honestly, they are not blind. They can see. They can't see well, but the bat species we have here in Kentucky and North America all have smaller eyes. But when you get to species that eat fruit, they actually have these giant eyes, because that's how they find food. They don't do the echolocation because they're not trying to catch insects.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, thank you, Matt. We greatly appreciate you coming in again and doing another Wildlife Sounds from the Forest.
Excellent. Glad to be here.
All right, thank you for joining us today. You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky. If you have any questions about things that you heard on today's show, please visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Stay tuned each Thursday from 10 to 11 a.m. for another edition of From the Woods, Kentucky.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the Central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.